Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's episode is titled, Books Make Great Company, Why We Read in an Age of Social Media. And I'm joined by Ann Weirder-Rowland from the University of Kansas. My name is Andy Mink. I am the Vice President for Education Programs at the Center. I want to welcome you tonight on behalf of my staff, Libby and Mike, and our graduate interns, Hannah and Carly and Josh. We're very pleased to have all of you joining us today after what I suspect was a full day at school, whether it was in some kind of hybrid model or maybe you're back face-to-face, or perhaps you're still teaching virtually, as my son in high school in Chapel Hill, North Carolina is learning. In particular, I want to welcome Jeffrey. Jeffrey's here from LA tonight. Liz is here from Utica, New York. Our friend Gregory is from the Stratford School in San Jose, and Ellen, who I don't think thought that I'd be able to pronounce where she's from, is from Lake Ronkonkoma in New York. But in particular, I want to welcome Rob, who slipped in just as the door was closing and the bell was ringing. Rob's a good friend of our guest tonight, and he's here to heckle Ann from his seat in Atlanta. The National Humanities Center is located in Durham, North Carolina. We're working largely remotely now, although many of our fellows have come to North Carolina for the year. You know, in some ways, when I eavesdrop on and I'm around the work that our fellows do on an annual basis, it occurs to me that in some ways they're doing exactly what I invited you to consider doing in the opening question. That is, whether they're in literary studies or history or philosophy or art or music, etc., they're in some ways in conversation with the characters and the actors and the people from the past who have created in some ways a blueprint for us to understand our world better, to almost with training wheels, to experience the empathies and the perspectives and the worldviews of others who have lived in some other place, sometimes long ago. And they're carefully and meticulously and precisely trying to reanimate that so the rest of us can better understand it. And as watching each of you respond to that question, I was really struck by how many of you seemed not only to have an answer instantly, but it seemed to be based on a genuine emotional connection, whether that was wonderment or curiosity or affection. Maybe it was a character that you wanted to ask questions of and get explanations from. But one of the things that many of you noted, not just in the fantastic characters of fiction like Harry Potter, but many of you noted this sensation, this sensibility of being shown something that you wouldn't see otherwise. And I want you to hang on that tonight while we talk with Professor Rowland about books and literary interactions. This sense that you can visit or you can see or even experience and feel something that you wouldn't feel otherwise. And to me, that's a really powerful, almost superpower of what literature brings. All the resources that we share with you tonight are located in the Humanities in Class Digital Library. Please do use your library card to visit this site regularly. Not only can you access those resources, for example, if you type in reading, you might pull up, or literary studies, you might pull up other work that we've done with past fellows. You might pull up other resources by organizations that are contributing to our digital archives. You might even be able to pull up things that other users have created, other teachers and educators have created. But because this is cross-discoverable, it does give you access to a wide landscape of instructional and scholarly resources. If tonight's topic really does inspire you and you want to investigate a little bit more deeply, not only the thinking behind the session, but some of the instructional resources that may allow you to apply this in your teaching, please do use this as a free and open session. I also want to encourage you to visit the Humanities in Class webinar series group in the library. This is where we will be posting all of the resources for each webinar. Also, we'll be posting the recording of the webinar once it's completed. Varsha, to tell you directly, you do not get PD hours for watching these videos. You need to attend the live session. However, these become good resources for your classroom. And what we've begun to do is not only provide the full 75 to 90 minute recording, but we also have a graduate student, Carly, who's going through and segmenting them into 8, 10, 12-minute topical sections. So if you'd like to share those with your students in a prompt or in an assessment or maybe something they're doing in a flipped classroom, you're more than welcome to do so. And I should note, too, that while the library is largely teacher-facing, you're also more than welcome to have your students sign up and come and work with the materials that we have located. I'd also like to mention that very soon we'll be having our annual spring conference. It will be in a virtual format, which may be actually kind of appropriate for the topic this year, starting with our April 7th webinar titled Teaching Artificial Intelligence, Exploring New Frontiers for Learning. We'll launch a series of weekly events, panels, speakers, and discussions around the role of artificial intelligence in our world and our culture. We'll be exploring humanities-based topics like privacy and ethics and morality. We'll be talking about the ways that AI is used in art and film, and we'll be trying to come to some consensus around what the future of thinking might be, given this artificial intelligence that now is frankly infused in our life already. All of these events are free. They're also going to be recorded and be located at the digital library, and I hope that you can join, or again, perhaps maybe have your students join us for some of the more relevant sessions. Lastly, I'd like to remind you that we do have a slate of online courses. Many of you need and collect the documentation from our webinars, 5 hours of attending the live event. But you can also attend the online course and earn 35 hours. So if you are interested in more professional development opportunities, or you simply want to investigate these topics more deeply, I'd encourage you to look at those. Our next slate begins on March the 8th. And in fact, the one on becoming visually literate might be appropriate if you're in tonight's session. We'll be discussing and working in the scholarship around understanding how visual interpretation and analysis is a form of literacy in your classroom as well. I want to thank our Teacher Advisory Council, including several I see in the room tonight, who have been working with us diligently for this disrupted and very bizarre year. They each were selected last spring, and for an annual and year-long term, contribute to our work. They give us feedback on the things that we're developing, the programs that we have. We'll be opening applications for next year's council next month, and I'll be sure you get all that information. So finally, I want to remind you of tonight's webinar platform and the way it works. I know many of you have attended many of our webinars, but I suspect there's some new faces in the room as well. This is an audio and PowerPoint only webinar. It will sound almost like a radio program sometimes, more than something that you're watching. The slides can be accessed through the Slides tab that you'll see at the very top of your screen on the left. You're welcome to bounce in and out of those tabs and look at some of the other documentation we have. But if you can't see the slides, or if at some point you hear something and you'd like to go back, don't forget to click that tab and it will immediately bring them up. I also would encourage you to play with your volume control. If the audio is for some reason not clear or is low, that button can be found right above the most important function for you, which is the audience chat and the Ask Professor Roland button tab. This is where you can share your thoughts. You can respond to things that we're saying. As the moderator, I'll bring those questions to Professor Roland at the appropriate time, and we'll integrate them into the conversation. So again, you have joined us tonight for the webinar titled Books Make Great Company, Why We Read in an Age of Social Media. I'm extremely pleased to be joined by Ann Weirda-Roland from University of Kansas. She's an associate professor of English literature. And in fact, Ann spent her year last year with us, a truncated year, a shortened year, but she was a fellow at the center in 2019-20 and now currently serves on our board of trustees. Hey, Ann, over in Kansas, thank you for joining us.
I'm so happy to be here and really happy to have this chance to talk about some things that I've been thinking about and kind of share. It looks like there's a lot of love of books going through the chat line. And so I'm really happy to be with this community of active, curious readers, thinkers, teachers, it looks like. Very happy to have this chance.
Well, good. I'm going to turn the PowerPoint over to you in a moment. I'm also going to welcome Alina Hunt, who is with us from the North Carolina School of Science and Math in Durham. Alina is a member of our Teacher Advisory Council. She'll also be tonight's TA and be dropping links and various questions in the chat box. But Ann, before we start, if you don't mind, I'm going to hit you with a personal question.
Okay.
I'm going to ask you to be as vulnerable as we asked our audience in the opening slide. So, Professor, can you tell me, please, tell us about when you were younger, and you can define younger as you want. I'm thinking probably middle grades age-ish, somewhere in there, maybe before high school when reading became more assigned and literature became more of a curriculum. At that time when you fell headfirst into a book or a series of books, and there was a character you felt close to. I mean, you felt like this person was a friend, and if something bad happened to him, it was heartbreaking. And if something good happened to him, it was mesmerizing. So tell us who that character is.
Oh, I went through so many different strings of characters like that. I had my Laura Ingalls Wilder phase, and had grown up and was reading in South Dakota at that time, so that seemed particularly fascinating. But I also had an Anne of Green Gables phase. I went through lots of romance novels that I can't even remember the names of or the characters. I think that was more kind of information gathering. And I think there's a book that I teach now when I teach Gothic literature, Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, that I read when I was probably in middle school. And I don't know if anybody knows that book. It's actually just been made into a new show, I think, but Hitchcock also did a fabulous movie version of it. And that narrator, nameless narrator, very young and naive, I think I really identified with her and felt I'm seeing, it looks like somebody knows Rebecca. So yeah, that's a great question and gets right to what I'm hoping we're going to get to talk about, which is how exactly is it that these characters feel so real? Why is that the case? And so I'm going to be talking off of notes here. Andy, are you ready for me to kind of dive in?
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, by the way. And it's interesting. It's difficult for me as I'm moderating this and I'm seeing the chat and I'm sort of imagining what you're about to say. It's hard for me not to see us all walking through this looking glass, and we appreciate you being here to guide us through that.
Absolutely. Like I said, I'm so thrilled for a chance to have this conversation, and I'm going to advance this next slide here. I'm going to be talking off of an outline. I have a couple of places where I'll pose a question, but I just want to really encourage everybody to ask questions. I'm not too great at kind of multitasking with the talking and the chat kind of stuff, so I'll rely on Andy to feed a lot of questions to me. But
that's you covered.
Yeah, just don't hesitate to interrupt. So the title of my talk, this idea that books make great company, I was asked to give this title last spring, and right about that time, this book review came across my front door from the New York Times. So the title of my talk and the title of this issue of the New York Times Book Review is really an old cliche, right? We're already talking about it. Books make great company. And I turned to it last spring, and I suspect the editors of the book review did as well, out of the feeling that this really kind of maybe tired phrase had been newly activated, given a kind of a new life by what at that point in April were these strange new conditions of quarantine life and this new idea of social distancing. So I wanted to start just acknowledging that context that we're coming to this topic in, this pandemic and our more isolated quarantined life. And it's forced a national reckoning on a lot of different issues. But I want to suggest today that it's also forced a national conversation, or maybe just a personal reflections on the question of how to be social, how to be with others, a conversation about company. What makes it bad, good, great, even dangerous at this point? How best to keep it? Which app can best deliver it? And how to calibrate and mix all its various elements of distance and proximity, presence and absence, the virtual and the physical, the audio and the visual. And over the course of the last year, we've been forced to bring together two seemingly totally contradictory terms, social and distance, and to construct this new paradigm of social distance. And, many have suggested that this experience of being forced to social distance, has just exposed or accelerated something that was already happening. We live in a culture that it seems to be increasingly choosing virtual company over real company. And others have suggested that maybe this year will have taught us the value of in-person, face-to-face human contact, and that perhaps the popularity and the use of social media may wane as we reemerge from our hibernation here. But I think we're all really newly self-aware about the range of options that we have for being social, the range of options we have for being with and communicating with others. And that's what I mean by we've all become kind of metaphysical philosophers on the question of company, even at the level of the most mundane daily tasks. Think of all the little decisions we're making each day about our use of social media. Every time we choose FaceTime over a regular phone call, or we choose to text rather than pick up the phone, or make a phone call, or we choose to turn off our Zoom cameras rather than on, or we debate whether or not to post a picture to our Instagram feed. All of those involve, we're all assessing exactly what these various media offer us and exactly how they connect us to others and put us in the company of others. So, my first question for you to contemplate and weigh in on is, have you noticed a change in your own reading habits, or in the reading habits of your family, or if you're a teacher, in the reading habits of your students during this last year of quarantine? And have you noticed what the experience of reading offers you, what it feels like to read a book as opposed to other, forms of social media in comparison to those? How has your awareness or your appreciation of reading changed in any significant way this past year? And I will say, while you're responding there, you can think about any kind of reading, and it doesn't necessarily have to be print form. It can be, many of us read on ebooks or Kindle or whatever. And it can be reading fiction, poetry, nonfiction. As we get into this conversation further, we're going to be talking about immersive, deep reading, the kind of reading that imaginative literature offers and that we associate with reading literature, and particularly the experience of reading fiction, reading novels. And my expertise here, I teach at the University of Kansas. I don't have expertise in teaching and talking about earlier, younger readers. But if some of you are working with those, I imagine there might be some expertise here in our virtual room. So please bring those things up as we go.
Well, you've posed a question, and many of our folks are starting to respond. And you know what, I'll actually echo something that Alina typed in, which is, and for me personally, this is not a pandemic oriented reflection, I think, but just living in this kind of social media saturated world, it's actually kind of hard to read long form fiction, much harder than it was when I was younger. And I wonder, I'm seeing a lot of comments scroll through that echo that. And I think you're right too, in sort of noting that this isn't about the mechanics of teaching reading as much as the way that your brain and your cognition responds to reading.
Absolutely, and that's one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit later. But people who, when we get into the kind of cognitive, psychological kind of, what's going on in the brain, But it's definitely true that, reading on the internet and digital reading encourages different kinds of reading circuits than, say, deep immersive reading, long form fiction, or it doesn't have to be long form, a short story. It's always a question of use it or lose it, I think, with cognitive structures. So it's absolutely something to think about.
And I'm not sure if, there's so many comments, and I suspect that we're going to get questions that are going to take us in different directions. And if I bring something to you that you don't feel is appropriate or that you want to focus on, please do just sidestep it. But I am intrigued by what Armin wrote, which is how much he appreciates audiobooks. So when you're talking about, engaging with literature, do you mean the physical act of holding a book and reading left to right, mostly left to right in English at least, or is it the interaction with the words however you receive them?
So I don't necessarily mean holding a physical book. I think it could mean reading a book on your phone or on your tablet or on your laptop or on a screen. But it is basically, when we get into the question, when we'll get there, that the idea of a kind of a deeper immersive reading, it is, it's not the kind of skipping and skimming that we tend to do on the internet, for example. Audiobooks are interesting, and I'm gonna bracket that for now and come back to that when we start talking about the different experience of reading a book than watching a movie, because I think audiobook is an interesting middle ground there. And so I want us to come back to that because I enjoy audiobooks very much and think that they do a lot of what reading does. So I'll keep, I'll keep going here and keep bringing things to me. I think when the editors of the book review here chose this title, Books Make Good Company, they added two ideas to this kind of reflection on, social media and social distancing. One, they added books and reading to the long list of social media resources that we have to keep in contact with others when physical proximity isn't possible or desirable. In other words, they're suggesting that books and media are a form of social media. And two, and it follows from that first one, they're suggesting that our current moment is not as extraordinary as we like to think. We've actually been here before. This seemingly unprecedented 21st century moment of social distancing, which is physical separation from others that is tempered, modulated, or punctuated by various forms of media, various forms of virtual company, that this has a history, and that history includes books and reading. We can imagine our way back into earlier centuries when people didn't have cars and planes and phones and email, and in order to cross distances and make them feel less alone in their solitude. And I think we tend to imagine them reading and writing letters to keep in touch with other people. But my title and this headline also asks us to think of them reading their books, reading Jane Austen, and using that experience as an experience that put them in the company of other people. To think of books and reading not just as a form of entertainment media, but also as a tried and true form of social media. So that's the first answer that I want to put out there to this question that I posed in the title of the webinar. Why do we read in an age of social media? We read because books and reading are a form of social media. And we're going to get to this, because they do a better job than a lot of other forms of social media of putting us in the presence and the company of other people. So partly what I'm asking us to indulge in is a kind of a thought experiment. The idea, if you look online and Google what's the history of social media, when was it, it doesn't go back. It starts in the 70s and the 90s, 1970s and 1990s. And I would say just social media is actually not a late 20th century invention. Before the smartphone, there was the book. The book functions, has historically functioned, still functions as what we could call a technology of intimacy, a tool for communicating and being in relationship with others. And like the smartphone, the book is what is often referred to as a relational artifact, a thing that seems to embody and broadcast a human presence, and as such, a thing that can both offer psychological and emotional consolations and make psychological and emotional demands on us, its readers. Okay, I'm now gonna go on. Now, I think over the course of the 20th century and into these early decades of the 21st century, we've lost sight of the social aspects of reading, at least in some places we have. And I would love to hear if you agree with me on that, and if you feel like your teachers and your fellow readers are really in touch with the social aspects of it still. But in 1936, one of the greatest literary critics, Walter Benjamin, wrote that reading a novel is an experience of isolation and solitude. And he was saying what was increasingly becoming a kind of a standard view. And that's an image, and you can see that here in these images I've put up, that really stuck in the larger cultural imagination. Fiction changed. Modernist fiction in the 20th century turned away from a kind of a storytelling narrator and the direct address. Does anybody remember that moment in Jane Eyre when I think it's the start of the last chapter, reader, I married him. That turn where the narrator all of a sudden is talking directly to the reader. Those kinds of things started to feel old-fashioned, and text became much more experimental in form. In English departments, teachers and professors began to reject this old paradigm of reading for the author or reading to understand what the author meant to convey, what the author's intentions. And they began to teach that the literary text is autonomous, which they defined on all sorts of different ways, but they taught the autonomy of the literary text. And then, of course, a whole host of other media and communication technologies rose to compete with and replace reading, writing, and books, the primary ways to communicate and be with others. And so by the time the internet came along, I think we were pretty well conditioned to think of literary reading as a solitary experience and even as an asocial activity, one that stood in opposition to our online connected lives. And as those lives have become busier and more distracted and all the more anxiety producing, the image of the solitary book reader has become increasingly nostalgic, I think. The image of a self-sufficient solitary reader immersed in a book, needing no sound effects, no pictures, no videos, no visual aids. It's kind of become this image of a reading experience that we put in our personal past or in our historical past. And it's a state we often worry is in danger.
Before you move on, Professor, I do have one clarifying question.
Yeah.
This question is from Alina. Can you or will you draw a distinction in what you're describing between literature and nonfiction or other kinds of texts? So we're talking specifically about engaging with literature, correct?
Yeah, right now I pretty much have moved on to that. Although So, now I'm going to be talking about the history of books as a social form. And in that sense, that is not necessarily fiction or imaginative literature. That could be nonfiction, that could be history, that could be essays, all a range of things. Anything really that demands a kind of sustained attention, really. Does that address the question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay. So, in fact, I think that image, that kind of nostalgic, romantic image of the solitary reader, I think it's a bit of an historical anomaly. It's a back formation of present-day nostalgia fed by anxiety, about our hyper-connected, hysterical, video-fed digital world. In reality, books and reading were thoroughly embedded in social networks and social experience in the 18th and 19th centuries when they were becoming widely used. And reading led to a range of social activities, some of which are still going on now. And as I talk about what they used to do with and around books in the 19th century, you might hear things that we're still doing. Reading aloud in the home with family and friends, the rise of book clubs and literary societies, literary tourism, traveling to visit the sites associated with authors and books. This is a huge thing with Harry Potter fans, I know. Literary themed parties, where, or even the idea here that we started with, having a dinner party where everyone comes dressed as their favorite character. All of these things were done in the 19th century. And books were also exchanged as a way to form friendships or sustain relationships, and used as ways to be together. I do work on the British Romantic poet John Keats, and he's someone who had to deal with isolation and separation from friends and family, both because of illness, but also his brother, George Keats, emigrated to the United States and ended up settling in Kentucky. And so we have a lot of letters that were written from John to George, from John in London to George in Louisville, Kentucky. And at one point he says to George, he suggests that they both read Shakespeare at 10 p.m. on Sunday nights. And he says, and then we shall be as near each other as blind bodies can be in the same room. And the thing that I love the most about that phrase is the fact that he's added blind bodies there, because you can see here, he is thinking about the different ways that we are with people in the same room, but unable to see each other, not in the same room, but still we feel their presence in some way. And he suggests there that if they're both reading Shakespeare at the same time, they are together. That's something that they had loved to do when they were living together. So all of that activity, plus the way they talked about the experience of reading as putting them in conversation with others, the metaphors they used to describe books as friends, and these are the quotes that are on the screen right now. All of this has led literary historians to describe 19th century reading culture as friendly reading culture or companionate reading culture, a culture in which books and reading were thoroughly embedded in friendship and social structures. So I've got a quote here from Ruskin's lecture on the King's Treasures, which was reprinted in a volume called Sesame and Lilies. And that was on every bookshelf in most middle-class homes in Great Britain and America by the end of the 19th century. And it really set the terms for thinking about reading great literature. And here it wouldn't necessarily be novels. In fact, it would be essays and reading great literature as having a conversation with great men. Now, he is very elitist in his approach to this, but you can see that metaphor that he's activating. Books are people who will talk to us as long as we like. You see Hazlitt there talking about rereading a favorite book as if it's like greeting a long lost friend, an old beloved friend. As you're looking at these things, one of the important things to think about is this was not uncontested, necessarily like easy terrain. These metaphors at that time were not just kind of platitudes. They were engaged in debating their current form of social media, much like we are engaged in debating the use and overuse of smartphones and social media today. They too felt overwhelmed by all the new media forms in their world. They had questions about what they were allowing into their homes and whether all this time spent with mediated forms was healthy. So Hazlitt there is comparing real friendships to book friendships. And he's actually saying that actually some friendships with books last longer than friendships with real people. And Porter is talking about how to choose the books you read and warning against the bad company of bad books. So all of these debates made about their present day, their latest form of social media, which was all print and books and periodicals. All of these made readers in the 19th century very aware of both the solitary and the sociable aspects of reading, highly aware of how being alone and being with others can come together in a unique way in the process of reading. And the person who really formulated this best was Marcel Proust, the author of In Search of Lost Times, the French novelist. And he wrote, right in the first decade of the 20th century, he wrote a response to Ruskin, to the essay there that I'm quoting. And it's an essay that's often was printed under the title On Reading. And in the readings that I circulated, both Marianne Wolf and Peter Mendelsohn refer to this Proust essay On Reading. It's a great one, a classic. And in that, he says, reading is actually not like a conversation with friends. He says, yes, it puts you in the presence of another person. Yes, that other person can come to feel like a friend and a companion and someone you know very well. But reading is still not like a conversation with a friend. It is its own miraculous form of communication and conversation. It is, in his words, communication in the midst of solitude. When you read, he writes, you receive the communication of another. You hear the thoughts and feelings of another person, but you remain alone. And thus you have full access to your own intellectual and emotional powers. You can somehow, and this is what for Proust is so miraculous about reading, you can somehow pay full attention to someone else and to yourself at the same time. Now, I think that's a great description of reading. And I think we're in a really amazing position here in the 21st century to deepen our understanding of what Proust is talking about, to understand this unique blend of sociability and solitude that reading offers. And we're in such a good position, on the one hand, because we've just come out of this year where we're paying so much attention to questions of company and how it feels like being with other people through these various new media forms. But we're also in this position because cognitive psychology and neuroscience has given us new insights about the reading brain and the psychological and cognitive processes that go on when we read. So books as friends, are books as great company. They are not just historical metaphors. They are not just signs of a historical an experience of reading. I also think they're psychological cognitive symptoms. They're offering us clues and telling us something about how we experience books and reading, about what's going on in our brain. So let me pause there before I jump into the cognitive stuff. I'm trying to, any questions you want to bring to me, Andy, now?
I do have one. And again, I think what's interesting is I can see the audience in the chat box really starting to parse out much of what you're sharing and associating it with their own lived experience. Here's a question though from Alina. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your views on what she terms the double destination of traditional children's books, meaning they're written for children, but at the same time, adults can be very, very fond of them and hold on to them, whether they read them as a kid or not. So talk a little bit about children's lit in that double audience.
Well, and that's a great, of course, a classic site of reading together in the home, right? And not just reading with friends or reading, but parents reading with children, or older siblings reading with younger siblings. And often we are reading text. And so in some ways, what we can kind of circle back on this, because a lot of what we're going to be moving into now is just how much of what happens in a text is happening in the reader and what the reader brings to it. So the fact that a children's book can have a double audience, can hit, they can communicate a certain kind of story to a child, but be giving all of these other signals to an adult is a lot about it. One question is that happening because of the way it's written, or is that happening in the minds of those two readers? Basically, I'm not being very clear there, but we can maybe circle back here as we're talking, as we start to think about, because where we're going now is just to realize just how much of what is going on in a book the reader is the one who's bringing to it.
Great, thank you for that clarification.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, I'm going to go to add that in. So cognitive psychologists have identified something they call theory of mind as important to our social interactions generally, and more to the point now, important to how and why we read. And this is now particular is getting into fiction, stories with characters, fictional characters, to how and why we read fiction, to how and why the experience of reading often feels social and feels like the experience of being in the presence of others. So theory of mind is a special cognitive endowment of human beings. It's our capacity to attribute mental states to ourselves and to others. So we are able to have a theory of someone else's mind, which means we understand that other people have minds, they have interior lives, they have thoughts, feelings, desires that animate how they act and behave. And then we know to interpret and explain their behavior in terms of those mental states, in terms of the thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and desires that we imagine or theorize or represent to ourselves that they have. In other words, we see bodies as animated by minds. We see someone smile and we infer a mental state of happiness from that smile. We see tears rolling down someone's cheeks and we guess that that person must be sad. We don't guess that that person must have blocked tear ducts. We know to go to that mental explanation. Most of us do this constantly, do this effortlessly in our routine social interactions. And this ability, this theory of mind ability, is foundational to those interactions, to social intelligence and to feelings of empathy. But this cognitive endowment was first identified and named in the 1980s by scientists who are working on autism and who were using false belief tasks, which you can see one of the most famous ones here, to test neurotypical children and autistic children. So in other words, they realized that theory of mind was a cognitive endowment that most neurotypical people have by studying autism and realizing that many children and people with autism have difficulties with this. And the Sally Ann test that you see here, Sally and Ann. Sally has a basket, Ann has a box. Sally has a marble. It's a really big marble. And she puts it in her basket, and then she leaves the room. Ann takes the marble from the basket and puts it in the box, and then Ann leaves the room. Sally comes back, and she's looking for her marble. Where will Sally look for her marble? So that question, then, you can see basically how that requires the child to differentiate between what they know and what Sally knows. They need to be able to take Sally's perspective, and they need to be able to imagine that she could believe something that they in fact know to be wrong or false. So neurotypical children tend to develop this capacity for what's called mind reading or perspective taking around age 4 or 5. But autistic children often do not develop this capacity. Their theory of mind remains impaired to varying degrees. Now, when we take that to reading, and to reading fiction in particular, psychologists and literary theorists and scholars working together have taken this knowledge to the question of reading, and particularly to the reading of fiction, and they've produced a growing body of work on what happens in the brain when we read. They believe that fiction, in fact, relies on this cognitive endowment in its readers in all sorts of ways. Character is sketched for us in a few words and phrases, and we attribute a mind to that verbal construction, to that character. We endow it with the potential for a variety of thoughts, desires, and intentions, and we interpret behavior in terms of those mental states. Writers who famously underdescribe the emotions and thoughts of their characters, so you might think of Hemingway here, they rely on readers to do this interpretive work. When they say a character left the room and walked home in the rain, we know to take that behavior and interpret it as inferring some kind of mental state. But likewise, readers who famously over-describe all of the thoughts and emotions of their characters, say Jane Austen or Henry James, they rely on their readers being interested in the thoughts of others. And in fact, we as humans seem ready and willing and even eager, over-eager, in fact, to attribute human minds to characters, as well as to a range of other things, our pets and the weather being two that we constantly attribute human minds and agency to. And in fact, this research overlaps in really interesting ways with research on artificial intelligence, and maybe this will be coming up in your conference coming up, Andy, but they're noticing how people attribute minds to robots or to these computer programs that talk to us, such as Siri or Alexa. Sherry Turkle, who is at MIT and has a great book called Alone Together, which is about social media and how it is kind of changing our sense of ourselves. She tells an anecdote about the early language processing computer program Eliza, which was developed at MIT I think in the 70s. And it's a program where if you type in a question, it's designed to respond to the question in a way that mimics psychotherapy kind of discussion. So if you type in, "My mother is making me angry," the program will respond, "Tell me more about your mother?" ? And so it's just a computer program that's designed to pick up on a word and turn it into a question and shoot it back to you. But even the graduate students who knew exactly what it was and how it worked, the guy who developed it started to notice that the graduate students were going in to talk to Eliza and quite often. And so again, we attribute mind to things that don't have them, such as fictional characters. And we give it to a whole range of, remember that phrase I used, relational artifacts, inanimate things that we are able to have relationships with, things that work because humans are willing to credit them with a human mind. And as you can see on this slide, there are a range of theories about how our theory of mind capacity is used when we read fiction, what it contributes to that experience of reading fiction. But the most important idea here that I just want to pull out is the idea that our brains do not fully distinguish between real and fictional people. Our cognitive architecture runs and responds in largely the same way, whether it's faced with a real person or a representation of a person. And this is at the core of why books, narrators, characters come to life and feel like real people, and even become people we know and love, as we were talking earlier before we started. We give them their life when we give them their minds. And this is also at the core of how and why books and reading offer us a social experience, an experience of being with another person. Okay, I've seen a couple of questions.
Yeah. You've done it now, Anne. You've opened up a whole door of questions. So with your permission, we're going to pause the slides for a moment. I've got two or three that I'd like to get your feedback on. The first one actually comes from Maggie. Maggie's joining us from the University of Maine. And she wonders if this term mind reading, this concept of mind reading, might also be like interpreting symbolism that an author might use in their work. Would you say that they're synonymous or they're similar?
I would tend to think, I'm not sure what I understand interpreting symbolism to be would be a little different than this. So mind reading, it would be actually attributing a mind to like a character or a narrator. It's happening in some ways if you're reading a text where the author, where it's in first person and it feels like you're very much in the presence of the author, then you would be attributing a mind to the author in that case. But in terms of interpreting symbols, I think that would more be a kind of a psychologizing of that author. I would probably say that.
Yeah, great, thank you. So let's take that then maybe a step further. In terms of granting or creating this kind of mind perspective that you're describing, that also seems to rely on, or at least it seems that there would be a natural bias that's also involved in that. So if I'm animating the character, then I'm doing so with the experiences and the tools at my disposal. I'm going to give you a brief example and then ask you to comment. 2 or 3 sessions ago in our webinar series, we were joined by Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, who is a scholar at University of Pennsylvania. She's done a lot of work around imaginative fiction and race. And she said this kind of offhandedly, and I caught it. And I'm not sure how many folks in the audience picked up on it the way I did. Maybe I'm late to the game. But she made the comment that J.K. Rowling actually wrote Hermione, one of the main characters, as an African-American character. And there are clues in that, but everybody who read it instantly made her white. And then, of course, the film confirmed her bias. So I guess my question is, that's a lot of power for the reader to animate a character. Is there opportunity then for bias and even for inaccuracies, or is there even such a thing? Maybe it's just whatever an individual makes it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say there's definitely opportunity for bias. I mean, and what you've just, that example is a really good one. I mean, but you're right that we rely on what we know, and in fact, what the Peter Mendelsohn reading is going to show us is that we are pulling from our emotions, our memories, a whole range of things that is intensely personal, and we are using that as we imagine the world of a novel, say, or we imagine a character. So we bring our biases. We also, though, and this is what Marianne Wolf is talking about, we have an opportunity to experience empathy. Mind reading is also about taking on another's perspective. And to not only take it on, but to actually make it part of our own lived experience. So while there's a chance for bias, there is also a way that we have an opportunity to slip free of our biases, our bodies, maybe our gender and try another gender, our race and try another race, our time period and experience another time period. And reading has, for as many times that it offers us a way to confirm bias, it also, I think, offers us a chance to escape the constraints of our own personal biases and limitations, and to try something and inhabit some other new perspective. Yeah.
That's a really great point. And then as maybe a third extension, it's only been in the last 40 years or so that you can count on any popular book being made into a film or movie.
Right.
What's your opinion on the role of movie versions of texts and books and pieces of literature?
So that one I do want to bracket, because that we're going to get to that
we'll do.
And that's exactly where we want to go, because the biggest competition for reading a book is, of course, the movie version, or just watching as my children do, watching an episode of The Office for the 55th time. That
oh my
scene,
goodness! I am so tired of watching The Office in my house. Exactly. I want to just unplug the TV.
Exactly. Yeah. So we're gonna get to that, about how we can think about what reading offers that watching a movie doesn't offer.
Right.
And I appreciate having that kind of forecast.
Okay. One more question, then we're going to move on. Unfortunately, as the moderator, I'm also the timekeeper, so I do want to make sure we get through your full talk. But the last question before we move on is from Roberto. Roberto is joining us from Los Angeles Unified. And he addresses you and asks notes that you mentioned to a great extent that this idea of mind reading and our emotional connections to characters. Along this line of thought, are there also examples of physical connections, action, or reactions to these same characters? Do our bodies respond?
That's a fabulous question, and something that I'm thinking about right now, because I'm teaching Gothic literature, and that is as I'm always talking to my students, that is a literature that is designed to act on your body, to make you feel fear, to make the hair in the back of your neck stand up, and one of the things that Marianne Wolf talks about in the reading is that when we use our theory of mind to take on another's perspective, character's perspective, we bring that into this kind of deep cognitive structure, and we connect it up, not just with the thoughts, the intellectual, but with our own memories and feelings. And so we actually make it part of our lived experience. And we also activate, if people have heard of, and she talks briefly about this in the reading, if we think about mirroring neurons, we know now from looking at what's going on in the brain, when somebody reads a description of, someone running their hand over velvet, and a really great description of how that velvet feels. The same neurons that fire in our brain, as if we were also running our fingers, over that velvet. So in fact, it absolutely does work on our body. If you look at the brains, the same kinds of neurons are firing as if we were doing it ourselves. And that is really Marianne Wolf's point about immersive, imaginative reading. It allows us to take on someone else's perspective, which is mind reading, but it also becomes lived, embodied, felt experience. So that's a great question, and kind of sets us up right for where we're headed.
Fantastic. Roberto, thank you for the question, and I'm going to invite you to move forward.
Okay. So one of the readings I circulated is this book, Reader Come Home, which is by Marianne Wolf, and she is a cognitive psychologist who specializes in reading diversity. She's the director of UCLA's Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice. And the chapter I circulated, whether you have gotten to it or not, you can go back to it, goes through a range of cognitive and psychological benefits that come out of what she calls deep reading or immersive reading experiences. And she makes the connection that I was just starting to talk about how she talks about this mind reading or theory of mind as perspective taking, and how that our ability to pass into the perspective of another person to inhabit and move along with the thoughts and feelings and desires of a character, for example, that is actually a particular experience of empathy. And there's a growing body of work that shows that imaginative, immersive reading improves social intelligence and increases our empathy for others. And it's on page 50 where she talks a little bit about what I was already mentioning in response to the question, that perspective taking represents this complex mix of cognitive, social, and emotional processes that connect vision, language, and cognition with these extensive subcortical networks, by which she means are those parts of our brain related to emotion and memory. So through the process of reading, the effect in our brain, it's like we're living it ourselves. And she has this quote from Wendell Berry about how a sentence is a feelable thought, or it offers a felt sense. And that is, I think, a great description for the particular kind of empathy that is made possible in this immersive reading. So Wolf there and these other cognitive psychologists are giving us the second answer to the question in my title, why should we read in an age of social media? Wolf suggests that not only does reading provide us with a social experience that is cognitively and psychologically similar to other social experiences, but that reading increases our ability to bodily understand another and to empathize with that other. So one question that I'm asking now of Wolf, and you may be asking, and we've already had it posed, and she mentions it here, is this really unique to reading, to the process of reading? Can't television and movies, the episode of The Office, doesn't that also give us opportunities to use our theory of mind and to take on and experience the perspective of others? And Wolf here in this quote that I've given on the slide suggests that that they can to some extent, but that the quality of immersion is different when you enter the articulated thoughts of another by reading. And it's really, I wanted her to say more here. As an English professor interested in defending my trade, as a parent interested in promoting reading rather than watching television, or I'm betraying my age when I say watching television, watching their phones. So I would really like to make a case for the superiority of reading over watching. And it's really in the Peter Mendelsohn book that I think we see this comparison to watching a movie versus reading a book, and where he really, I think, does the best job of talking about that. And for those of you who tried to look at this reading, this is a picture book largely, and it doesn't scan easily. A lot is lost in the scan and in the copying. But Peter Mendelsohn is really, he is not a scholar. He is a book cover designer. And when he published this book, What We See When We Read, he was working as the associate art director at Alfred A. Knopf. And he now works as the creative director of The Atlantic, the magazine. And so if you read that, you're familiar with his design aesthetic. He's written a number of other books, including novels. And he calls this book, What We See When We Read, a phenomenology of reading, which is basically, a fancy word for he's trying to pay attention to and describe what happens in his brain and in his body when he reads. And because he is the book designer for book covers, is paying very close attention to reading and to visual imagery. His job is to read a book and then to come up with the cover design. So he's very good, I think, at thinking about the connection between the words on the page and the visual imagery that the reader, that they inspire and that the reader then brings to the book. And he begins and ends the book with this question of how does it compare to the experience of watching a film? And you can see him saying, and what I've quoted here, brought out here, is we may think they're similar, but in fact they're radically different. And so I'd be interested as people are thinking about posing questions or in the chat, if you can also add to your sense of what is that the difference of the experience. And Mendelsohn basically says, when we think about reading a book, when we remember it as if the story simply unfolds like the story in a film that we watch. But he says, but that is actually not what happens when we read. When we read, we're given a certain amount of information, but never enough, never as much as an image on a screen gives us, which gives us the full glance of a character. We're in fact given just little bits of things, maybe a mention of how she wore her hair or what kind of color eyes she had. And we as readers we are forced to imagine, to visualize, to fill in the gaps of the story, of our sense of the character, or of the setting. And then as we turn the page and we learn new information, we make adjustments to how we're imagining as we read on. So Mendelsohn points out that writers often give us very little information about their character's physical appearance, for example, and yet we as readers often feel that we can picture our favorite characters absolutely perfectly. And that is because we fill in the gaps. When something is left unsaid, we imagine it, and we're drawing on, this goes back to your earlier question, and we are drawing on what we know, what other people we, in our memory.
That might be a good place actually to insert a question from your old buddy Rob, who asks, if you can comment a little bit on how we read or hear accents in our mind as readers, or can you say anything about the way that writers sort of imply an accent in their dialogue?
Yeah, that's funny, and that's a great question. I haven't really thought about that. I'm just reacting now about how difficult it can be when accents are written when the dialect is, is transcribed too aggressively, and how we can feel that to actually be a hindrance to the reading and to the imagining, right? And sometimes it's more effective to just put in certain kinds of idioms that signal that accent or that. But, I would have to just be talking personally. I think we feel like we're hearing accents, but if I opened my mouth and said, oh, he talks like this, I could never produce it, right? I think it's a little bit like what Mendelsohn is saying. You think you can see the person clearly, but then if you were asked to draw it or to describe what you're saying, what you see, you feel you see so clearly, you often can't do that. And I think accents might be a similar kind of thing. So, one of Mendelsohn's key insights here, and it's not his originally, but it's driving his book, which is a really great book. For anybody who loves reading novels and books, I would really encourage you to look at this book. But one of his key insights is a sort of law of inverse effects. So the less that a text explicitly says, the more the reader's imagination is called upon, and then the more vivid and real that story or that character will become for that reader. Mendelsohn says it's precisely what the text does not elucidate that becomes an invitation to our imaginations. We imagine more when the author withholds details. And when we imagine more, the stories and the characters become more real. Their life comes from the reader's imagination. And in fact, if we add this to our discussion of theory of mind above, it really does come to seem that the readers are supplying the mind and the body, the inner life and the appearance of successful characters. The readers do most of the work here. And a character is suggested, and this was what Mendelsohn talks about, by just a few phrases and a few features, sometimes a few catchphrases. But a character is often pretty much a cipher, a blank that we fill. And we each fill that character very differently. So reading from Mendelsohn is this process of co-creation. And he would say, actually, that films show us too much, that sometimes we actually want to see less and imagine more. And so that is one key difference between reading and seeing a film, seeing less and imagining more. I think another key difference is about pace. And this goes back to that audio book question. Pace and who's in control of the pace. At a later point in the book, Mendelsohn talks about how much of the reader's imagination is untethered from the text, how we daydream when we read. Novels invite readers' minds to wander, to associate. Think about when you're reading a book and you look up from the page and you're looking up, but your eyes aren't really focusing on anything out there because you're really looking in. You're thinking about whatever that story is bringing up from your own memory or your own life. Novels do that. They invite us to wander and to associate, to connect what we're reading with other feelings and memories. And a film, and maybe an audiobook, because an audiobook it is reading in that we are just in the words. We are having to do all that imaginative work like reading, but the pace is not ours. So the pacing of a film and of a recorded audiobook, a film in particular, it doesn't have the capacity to let you wander off and come back. It's designed to keep and to hold your attention, to hold your imagination and your gaze, which is to say that it's designed to constrain your attention and your imagination. Okay, so that gets us to this third and final answer to the question of why we read in an age of social media, and why I tell my children not to rewatch The Office, but to read a book instead. It's that books and reading are not only a form of social media, they are superior forms of social media. They do a better job of giving us virtual company, of making us feel we're in the presence of others. And that is because they require a level of activity and engagement and creativity from our minds and imaginations that visual media forms just do not, because they do that work for us. And so here is really where I'm hoping to hear more from you. And again, I want to, hope you can share your thoughts and reactions to what I've been saying and how it fits with your own reading experiences, or how you're teaching reading or experiencing reading yourself. Again, I want to stress, I can't really talk about early readers or teaching young readers. Marianne Wolf's book has great chapters on early reading and how to teach reading and think about creating what she calls a biliterate brain in years 0 to 5, a brain that can code switch between digital and print and move back and forth. But what I have here is what I've been trying to do in my college classroom, my English, teaching English, trying to talk about books and immersive reading as one form of social media among others, not as in opposition to it, not as something that they have to feel like they're turning away from social media, as an option in a continuum of media, that all of which offer varying calibrations of solitude and togetherness. I've tried a lot to bring discussions about the process, experience, and feelings of reading back into my, my college classroom, asking them, what are you being made to feel? What are you being invited to imagine here? This is something that happens when I teach Gothic, of course, but I've also added kind of reading experience as something that I talk about a lot. Try to be very explicit about the psychological and cognitive benefits of deep reading. I mean, I think my students they're navigating the same social media world that I am, and they are very savvy about what different social media forms offer them, and they know the shortcomings of many of them. So I think we have something to offer our students that can increase their quality of life. And then finally, this idea that we can foster awareness and respect for the creative, active, productive qualities of reading. To really put students in touch with what the amazing thing that is going on in their brain when they're reading, and not just to talk about the writing as the productive part of the study of literature. So I want to pause there and see what kind of questions and thoughts are coming up. If we have teachers here, and what kinds of things they're doing as you're doing as you are thinking about teaching reading in the age of social media.
Yeah, thank you. We do have some questions that are queuing up, and
Yeah.
it seems too that the distinction that you're making, at least for this session, is a curricular one in terms of teaching reading as a mechanical function versus teaching to engage in literature or wordcraft, and sort of modeling and being able to, with students now, I mean, being able to really articulate the values. And so using that as a springboard, here's a question for you. You teach at the University of Kansas. These are bright, educated kids. I'm sure all of them don't love reading. So what kind of pushback do you get from your college students, many of whom will have been in the classrooms of our audience a year or two prior?
Right.
When they push back at you, what do they say? Is it just simply like, I don't like reading? And if that's the case, is it because they haven't yet had this experience, or are they just not able to visualize what they're reading? As Raina asks, what's the pushback, and then why do you think that's there?
The pushback is often it takes so long. This was too long, kind of thing. And that's where I wonder if other people are seeing this or just experiencing it yourself. When we're reading all day long, right, on our phone, and we're reading text, we're reading online, we're always reading. But the kind of reading that we do through social media and through the internet is all designed to give us just kind of encapsulated facts, information. Actually, it's all designed to get us to buy something, but it's not to give you an experience of reading, right? So I get a lot of pushback. I mean, I wonder how many of you have heard this. Like, yeah, that novel was good, but it could have been a lot shorter. It could have told that story in 50 pages rather than 250. So I get that a lot. And way back when, I mean, even just 2 years ago, I would try to not have laptops or devices in the classroom, really try to just have books and have the class look at each other and talk about things. Of course, that's completely out the window now that we're all on Zoom and are, teaching remotely, for those of us who are still doing that. But I also moved away from that requirement and just started basically acknowledging that, we are all in this space. So if something comes up in a classroom, I ask somebody to look it up on, to Google it quickly. We might as well just acknowledge that these resources are here. And then I want to really be talking to my students about what they can get if they give a book the time and the attention, what the benefits are. Mm-hmm. And there, I think they're pretty receptive.
Thank you for saying that. I recently, meaning before the pandemic, which could have been a decade ago, had a conversation with an administrator actually at Los Angeles Unified, and she expressed this hope that her educators, and I'm going to extend this to all educators, and parents and adults, that they will remember the aesthetics of reading when they are teaching reading or assigning reading or dealing with reading. And I mean that again in sort of this literature context, not informational reading. Am I correct in inferring that one of your big recommendations to our audience tonight is for them to read too, just personally, to reconnect and have that experience that you've been describing, to remember what that feels like, to then inspire them to do the same with their kids or their students? Is that a fair recommendation you might make?
I mean, if you read this Peter Mendelsohn, he is just basically drawing on his own experience. And, we all know that as educators, you have to tap into something you know and love if you want to be effective in teaching it and communicating why it's why you know and why you love it. And students can sense that. So I think that is, and let me just say, I 5 nights out of 6, maybe. I've got I'm in bed before I fall asleep doing a crossword puzzle on my phone. That's been me lately. So it is hard to carve out that mental space and to keep those reading circuits, those deeper reading circuits, in tune and ready to go. Because our brains are getting rewired all the time. Every day we're online, and our brains are getting rewired against that. So I think you have to be really aware of the benefits, and you have to nurture it in yourself and in your families and in your students.
That's a great point. Thank you. I see you have one more slide, I think, with some suggested readings. I'm going to ask you to share that, and then I've got one final question.
Yeah, I don't really, thank you for reminding me. I don't really have, these are just a few things, the things that I circulated, but also some other things. And they are mostly about this literary reading and cognitive psychology, if you're interested in that. And I will say that at least my college students, they are thinking about how to make friends, and that they are there in college to get a degree, to learn something, but they are there for those social connections, and hopefully we'll all be back on campus and able to experience that again next year. But so they're thinking about these things, and so I think I found them very interested in hearing about these kinds of emotional intelligence and the kind of ability to empathize, and how reading fosters that. So this is further resources on that front.
Great. Anne, I've got one final question for you. And again, I'm going to conclude with a personal question as I began.
Okay.
So Anne, what are you reading right now? Tell us some recommendations of what you're reading personally, not professionally.
Personally.
Yeah. What books are on the bedside table?
So right now, I've been reading the Honorable Schoolboy, which is the spy novel, and I'm totally blanking on the John le Carré. So he died, I think, a few months ago, and there was all of this discussion about his life and his career, and I happen to be married to a fan of John le Carré's novels, and who read them when he was in middle school and remembers all the George Smiley and all these characters. They're very, very, it is a very masculine Cold War world, and I am reading it because somebody described them as novels of manners, and they really are. The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, I just read, and now I've moved on. And Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, and now I've moved on to this one. And it is a totally foreign world and foreign set of characters, and I'm probably reading it as a complete escape from my real life, and maybe to get to know my husband of almost 25 years a little better in the way that we do that. Again, it's a social thing. But yeah, that's what I'm reading right now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that recommendation as well as your insights tonight. And thank you so much for joining us.
This is great. Thank you all for the questions and the opportunity. I enjoyed it very much.
I also want to thank Alina Hunt for joining us as our TA tonight. She has dropped some resources in the audience chat. You can also find those same resources in the folder associated with tonight's webinar that is in the digital library. And I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight for this webinar. I'm really pleased to see such active chat and to hear from all of you your thoughts on reading and literature and your teaching. Please do follow the National Humanities Center and our social media feeds. Ironically, our Twitter and our Facebook will give you notice of upcoming events, including the Artificial Intelligence at the Humanities Conference that we'll be hosting next in 2 months. I do hope to see you at a future webinar that may be the next one, which is scheduled for March the 4th. I'll be joined by past fellow Rebecca Getz from New York University, who will be discussing her work titled Baptism of Early Virginia, How Christianity Shaped Race. Thanks again. Have a great day at school tomorrow, whatever form that may be. We'll see you next time with the Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night, everyone.